Hello, my name is Professor Nadine Naber. I'm a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm the author of several books. Some of them are relevant to this topic of Arab American youth. One of them, for example, is called Arab America, Gender, Cultural Politics, and Activism. And the other is called Race and Arab Americans. And I'll be drawing on some of my research from those books in my lecture. Working with Arab American youth now for approximately 30 years, I've noticed repeated types of experiences with anti-Arab racism that I'm sort of going to open up with as I enter into my discussion on Arab American youth activism and what we need to know to understand this topic, and possibly become allies to Arab American youth and their various struggles. So I'll just give you some examples of, what youth from Arab American communities face. There was a high school student who raised her hand in class, and her teacher said, raise your other hand. And then the student raised their other hand. And then the teacher said, that's how all of you should come here, with your hands up. So that's just one example of the daily, ongoing experiences with anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism that is incredibly profound across the United States, affecting Arab youth in ways that are silenced, ignored, and invisible. Most people don't even know that these issues exist and that Arab American youth are facing them on a daily basis in their classrooms, on the schoolyard, on the bus, on the train to college, or on the streets, at the workplace, and the list goes on. So before we get into the topic of Arab American youth and anti-Arab racism, I wanted to provide you with some frameworks that I think would be useful. First, the framework that is really important to all of my work is this framework of joint struggle, which is another way of saying coalition, which means that all forms of racism are interconnected, and we cannot address one without addressing them all. If we do address, for example, racism against Latinos or Black communities in an isolated way, we end up playing into oppression Olympics, or this idea that one group is more oppressed than the other, and therefore, our issues should be at the center of all discussions. And so when I say, that I'm committed to challenging oppression Olympics, I would also add to that we can't address all of our different community struggles with racism without understanding that there are many kinds of racism. If we use one definition of racism to explain the struggles of all communities, for example, if we take the Black struggle and say that the way that Black folks experience racism, that would be the litmus test for whether another community is experiencing racism. For example, if we talk about Arab Americans, they might not experience racism necessarily because someone targeted them based on the color of their skin. It might be because a woman is wearing a headscarf, which is basically the marker of racism. There would be their clothing. Or if someone's name is Muhammad, they might be a target of anti-Muslim racism, not necessarily based on their skin color. So that's just an example of that. We really need to have a skill set of the different kinds of racism, the logics through which they operate, the way they work, and the way people experience them. So if we think about, anti-Arab racism, I use the term imperialist racism. And the reason I use that is partly to signpost to the ways that we need a global framework to understand the racism that Arab American youth experience. So let me talk a little bit about imperialist racism. So imperialist racism has two logics to it, or it operates according to two kinds of thought. One is this idea of, we can say, nation-based racism that I'll explain in a minute. And the other is cultural racism, which I'll explain in a minute. So nation-based racism is the idea that, these people are the enemy of the US nation. sometimes people use the word the enemy within to talk about immigrant communities that are coming to the US from a place that the US has been invading. So the example of that could be Japanese Americans during the period of internment. So here it's that, you're seen as the enemy within. So that would be nation-based racism. So how does that affect Arab American youth? The example I gave at the beginning of the kid whose teacher said, you should all come here with your hands up. And then you have the repeated experiences of, go back home, people pulling off the scarves of Arab Muslim women, youth, saying, take your scarf off, or are you still representing Osama bin Laden, right? So it's either if she wears the scarf, she is a potential terrorist supporter, and if she takes her scarf off, she's a real American. And so, we have Muslim boys, Arab Muslim boys who have reported lots of gender-based stereotypes, like someone walking up to a Muslim boy saying, how many women have you killed today, right? And that's that stereotype that Arab Muslim culture is the most oppressive to women out of all cultures. So if we go to this other concept, cultural racism is the idea that, some people use this concept a lot in the news media around the aftermath of September 11th. They called the backlash against Arab Americans, George Bush had used this concept at the time, the clash of civilizations, right? So that was a justification for the war on terror, was that we need to go over there and intervene and bomb and destroy these nations, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., because they're uncivilized. And so the concept of cultural racism is this idea that these people are inferior to whites because of their culture and their religion. And so together, these ideas of Arab Americans as enemy of the nation, plus the idea that their culture and religion is backwards and inferior, those ideas together constitute or make up what I am referring to when I say anti-Arab racism, or the racism that Arab Americans experience in the United States. Now we're going to add to the discussion a whole nother can of worms, which is that according to the US Census and nearly all federal as well as state policies and forms of categorization and forms in general, Arab Americans are classified as Caucasian. So at most universities on an admission form or high school, when it says race, Arab families will be checking Caucasian. They're expected to check Caucasian. And so this creates a dynamic called Arab American invisibility, which basically means that you're targeted by racism, but you're classified as white. And as a result, you don't have any opportunity to challenge the racism that your community is experiencing. Because in the United States, you need to have a category, a racial / ethnic category, to be able to demand rights and resources. And I won't get into that now, that's a long story, but that's basically how civil rights operate, as well as the way that resources are distributed when it comes to immigrant communities, whether it's social services or access to translators or mental health care. The list just goes on and on high school campuses and college campuses. This has a profound impact on youth who need specific mental health services or advisors, maybe who speak Arabic, and those will not be available as a result, or will be few and far between. And so as I was addressing anti-Arab racism, I just want to, before I move on to some more specific ideas, I wanted to push home the idea again that we cannot talk about anti-Arab racism without a global perspective. And there are many approaches out there to address anti-Arab racism that do not use a global perspective. And I'll just give you some examples because you might be familiar with those. So for example, it would be like when the Muslim ban was, at play with the Trump administration, you had all these families experiencing family separation, even babies, who were in one country and the mother was in, say Yemen or Djibouti trying to get reunited with her child. So you have these issues, right? And then in the United States, even among, among liberal discourses of people who truly do care, we often get caught up in these frameworks that actually cannot get at the root of the problem. So that dominant frameworks often will entail, in that example of the Muslim ban, immigrant inclusion or religious tolerance. So that would be like saying, we just need to include Muslims and treat them as Americans. And that would be an argument for ending the Muslim ban and making it all, better. But the reality is that as long as the US is engaged in the war on terror, anti-Arab policies will persist. Because the Muslim ban isn't an isolated policy, and it's not just an immigration policy. It's a policy that's an extension of the war on terror, and it operates as a justification for the war by perpetuating the idea that Muslims and people from the Arab region are people to be feared, are people who can't be trusted, are people that are not American and should not be allowed to be part of our society. And so I just wanted to push that point home because it's really important when we think about Arab American youth activism, because when Arab American youth are standing up for racial justice and engaging in activism, they are coming at it from a global perspective. It's, common sense knowledge. There's a shared consensus, right? That the racism that Arab American youth are up against are an extension of the US war on terror. And so we need to think about racial justice and anti-war or anti-militarism as both part of the agenda of Arab American youth's racial justice and social justice goals and agendas. So we can talk a little bit about, so now I'm going to actually shift to another really profound area that Arab American youth face before I get into a discussion of Arab American youth activism. So, one of the really heart-wrenching realities of Arab American life is that especially for youth who are growing up, coming of age today, is really, there's just so much death and destruction taking place in the 22 Arab countries that, a lot of youth living in the United States have direct family members living in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, you can imagine Palestine, Egypt, where there's just, in Lebanon at this moment, just absolute extreme devastation, whether it's from US-led war or, the impact of COVID even, which the US has a lot to do with the way that, the medical industry and the United States' domination of the vaccine is playing out, but that's another topic. So we can, given this kind of what we can say is living in a state of crisis, right? You go to school and then you come home and your parents might have Arabic TV on, and all you see, and I saw this growing up, all you see is people who look like you being bombed or killed, and you see children really being, I hate to say it, it's a trigger warning, really. And it's ironic for me to say trigger warning because I'm going to say that, you see children shot intentionally by an Israeli soldier or a US soldier on the TV screen, when you come home from school. So you have this community that's really living in a state of crisis around the fact that basically our people are dying back home. And in addition to that, that there's a great deal of fear related to existing in the United States because of policies I'll go into momentarily, like the surveillance, FBI and federal government surveillance of Arab American communities, which creates a great deal of fear just around like going about your daily life. And so given all this, immigration bans, killings, bombings, family separations, it really covers up and overpowers and overwhelms this whole other area of Arab American life that's profoundly affects Arab American youth, and that is cultural struggles. So what do I mean by cultural struggles? What I mean by cultural struggles, and this is complicated to talk about, is that especially second generation youth who grow up in immigrant families often feel that they exist between two opposing or contradictory cultures. So this idea that, is both perpetuated by the United States media, as well as government rhetoric, as well as, textbooks in school, and also perpetuated by their immigrant community, which is that American culture is one thing and Arab culture is another, and that these are opposing and contradictory. And in fact, US discourse tends to portray Arab culture negatively, right? That, oh, this is a culture that's conservative, that abuses women, that, is stuck in the, in the past. Whereas, American culture is portrayed as democratic and has freedom, and women can wear whatever they want, and, all that. But then on the flip side, when Arab immigrant families come to the US and they feel under attack and they see their culture portrayed in all these negative ways, there's often an attempt to flip it and react to it by saying, oh, our culture, is it bad? It's good. And so then that actually can lead to an intensification of conservative family values, like, oh, well, our culture, it's kind of like when we say Black power or, red power, or someone saying, I'm Muslim and I'm proud, right? Or the fact that more and more women started wearing the headscarf after September 11th, which helps us understand how any community uplifts what they understand their culture to be when they feel that they are under attack by the dominant society. But I want to pause here and say that, so this whole, I will call it a problem, right, of defining culture in really rigid terms can be really constraining for youth, because you're kind of set up to exist as a split person, right? That you have this Arab side and then this American side. And I just want to comment on that for a moment, and say that the issue with this is that when people say Arab culture, whether it's the immigrant community saying it in a rigid way or the dominant US society saying it, neither of those are accurate representations of Arab culture. They're reactionary. They have everything to do with immigration experiences and how people react to living in the United States as Arab immigrants than they have to do with any real Arab culture. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. It's like saying, like if you say, we know that there are queer people who have, existed in the Arab region for centuries and centuries, right? And then when people come to the United States and they feel under attack and they want to uplift, a more conservative concept of their culture, they might say, you can't be gay and Arab, or gay Arabs don't exist. And if you're gay, that means you're American, right? So, nobody would say that in the Arab region in that way. It's a discourse that's produced out of the experience of immigration. And so I'm not going to get into that too much. And in fact, I've written an entire book about it, the book Arab America. But I'm saying this to say that in my role today as sharing some of the struggles that Arab American youth experience, I really want to uplift for educators that these cultural struggles are incredibly profound, and students often don't have any opportunity to address them or talk about them. And there are often very little resources in Arab American communities to work through these issues. And the reason for that is that the concept of culture has been set up in such rigid terms. And in addition to that, what I said before, which is that people feel like they're in a state of crisis, like our people are dying back home, or the Muslim ban is destroying my family. And so there isn't even a space to address these issues that happen on the level of identity and culture. But at the same time, these issues create incredible struggles for youth who feel like they don't belong anywhere, and they feel isolated. And that can lead to a whole set of issues, from, getting involved in violence and drugs to, so many other things. And so when I say that there's no such thing as a fixed culture, I'll just talk about that for a moment on, so what do we do about that? How do we, say, as educators or people who want to support Arab American youth, what do we do about that? And what we do about it, and I really insist on this anytime I speak about anything, what we do is we change the way we all talk about Arab culture, so that we avoid talking about culture outside of historical and political contexts. So let me explain what I mean by that. So let's say a student said that they were having this struggle where their parents told them they couldn't come to any events in the evening at the high school, and they were, a girl. So we could easily interpret that to be, oh, their parents are Arab and Muslim, and therefore they're conservative, and they're not allowing their daughter to go to a play at the school at night with her friends. That's usually the interpretation of such an incident or situation. But what we might not know about that situation is that same girl who wears the headscarf could have been walking through a walkway at the high school one day in the evening, and she could have been stopped by, let's say, a young man who, all alone, there's no one else around, and he could have said to her, and this is a real story, do you have a bomb in your bag? Right? So he targeted her as a Muslim and made a racial slur. And from there, she was scared to death to walk around on campus at night, and she told her parents about it. And then her parents said, you can no longer go to these events at night. So the purpose of my story is really to highlight how there's no such thing as, parents imposing culture on their children outside of the parents' life experience and reality and the context they live in. Just like any culture, we would never say that any culture exists in a vacuum. Cultures are always changing depending on the context. Of course, there are cultural sensibilities that immigrants bring to the United States, but they're not born with, culture that's timeless and unchanging, that basically they just impose wherever they go without it changing based on their lives, their lived experience. So we need to put culture in context. We need to think about cultural values as being alive and changing based on communities' struggles and experiences. And that's just one of many other experiences. I mean, another experience is the issue of domestic violence. If we think of every single community of color and immigrant community in the United States, I mean, we could think of undocumented Latinx communities, right? If a child is witnessing domestic violence, they may not call the police for help because they might be afraid that ICE will deport their parents, right? So it's similar here, where we might think of Arab immigrant community not reaching out in a case of domestic violence, and someone could say, oh, that's because the culture condones domestic violence. But if we look closer, it might be that that family was scared to death of the police because they know that their neighborhood's under surveillance, and at any point their father could be picked up for being a potential terrorist, because that's how the war on terror works. You can always be picked up because of a mistake with your name, or some paperwork problem, or I know people in my own family weren't able to get a boarding pass when they went to the airport because their name was on a terrorist watch list with the Department of Homeland Security. And the airline person said that your father can't have a boarding pass because he's on a government list in front of that father's children, here at Chicago O'Hare Airport, near where I live. And that the children were devastated with anxiety for many years after that. So these are the kinds of things, this is the context the community is living in. And so people enact their cultural values within that context. And if we approach culture, what we perceive to be cultural explanations for problems in Arab American communities, if we just reduce them to culture, we're actually reinforcing racism. Because what we're doing then is assuming there's such a thing as culture that people are born with. If we assume that cultures are unchanging and fixed, it can actually imply a biological argument, which is what racism is. And so my last point on this whole question of culture is that Arab American youth, most of the youth that I've ever interacted with, including myself when I was a youth, we are well aware of how culture is used against our communities, how racist ideas about our culture are used against our communities. And so the way that plays out then is that, so for example, if Arab American youth have a challenge that they're experiencing, like say the example of, let's say there was a gender violence issue in a family. So if that, if that family explained the issue of gender violence as an extension of their culture, or let's say of their religion, like Islam. So let's say they went to the media and said, my brother, harmed my sister because Islam told him that it was acceptable to harm his sister. Then that story would get a ton of media attention. And that daughter might get a lot of support from the broader society, because there's already this racist idea that Islam harms women. And it's created this huge emotional, sensibility in the US that Muslim women are victims, and that the American society needs to save Muslim women from their own families, right? And that's just become an ingrained part of US culture and society, this idea of saving Muslim women from their culture and religion. However, if the gender violence story had a different explanation. So for example, let's say the brother, his name was Usama, and he worked as a dishwasher. And every day he went to work, and the people, his colleagues at work, at the restaurant, called him Osama bin Laden. This was going on for a year. And he ended up with these issues, mental health issues, and issues of violence that underlied his action against his sister. And maybe he justified it with religion. I mean, maybe he said, I'm doing this because, God said I could. So let's say the story was told with that context. It might not be picked up by the media. A novelist might not write it and publish it and have it as a hot selling book at Barnes and Noble. So we Arab American youth are well aware that if we explain our issues in cultural terms that reinforce racism against our communities, that our stories will be recognized. But if we uplift the realities that our communities are facing, then, those stories are not going to make it to the media. And so I just wanted to put that out there as a reminder for how we approach and relate to Arab American youth and the cultural issues they might face with their parents, that we really need to really understand the broader picture of what Arab immigrant communities are going through. So I'm going to transition a bit to the topic of activism, around some of the different types of activism that Arab American youth are involved in. So we could say is that, again, this kind of brings us back to this discussion that when we think about anti-Arab racism, it's a racism that is an extension of the global war on terror, which I call imperialist racism. And so when you think of Arab American youth activism for racial justice, it always will involve anti-war activism. Those are combined because there's a common sense understanding among Arab American youth activists that racism against us operates to justify war. So if everybody believes that all Arab Americans have a potential for terrorism or violence, then that'll make, more and more people accept the war on terror. So that's just kind of a common sense understanding that the racism is there to justify war. So that's why to fight racism, we need to fight war. That's basically the point. So if we think of, and what's really hard about this is because the war on terror has been so profoundly convincing in the sense of that, the purpose of the war is to protect Americans from terrorism. Then when you see Arab American youth rising up against the war on Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Palestine, when you see that, it often isn't seen as legitimate social justice activism in the United States. It gets interpreted as support for terrorism. But what we really need to do is understand and retell that story, that Arab American youth activism against racism and war is really similar to the anti-war on Vietnam movement, or the movement to end the apartheid in South Africa, right? And so, and in fact, the history of Arab American youth activism is that it's always been in alignment with, you could say, left-leaning social justice struggles in the US. If you go back to the 1970s, Arab American youth student movements that were fighting for the liberation of Palestine from Israeli colonization were framing their activism and working with the third world student liberation movements, with there was a whole period of course, the civil rights movements of the 70s and 80s, where you had these national liberation movements uniting across the world. You had young Palestinian students educating Vietnamese students, Black students, Latinx students, Puerto Rican students about Palestine and vice versa. So when you go into the 90s, there was a long history of Arab American youth activism against the US war on Iraq. That's one example, and the US sanctions on Iraq, which Arab American youth talked about as a form of warfare, which I'll get into in a moment. And then you have the all along was alliance with Palestinian liberation and solidarity movements among youth in Palestine, in other Arab countries, and in the Palestinian diaspora. Those movements have always framed themselves as unified Palestinian movements between Palestine and its diasporas. So not seeing, the people who live in the diaspora as separate from the movements happening in the homeland. And I think that's another really important point to think about Arab youth activist movements. And so all along, while Arab American youth have been organizing movements that have changed depending on the historical moment in solidarity with Palestinian liberation and against US wars in Arab homelands, those movements have always integrated resistance against US policies that affect Arab Americans that are extensions of those wars. So for example, in the 1990s, President Clinton created what's called the Omnibus Counter-Terrorism Bill, which targeted Arab immigrants and justified and legitimized a process where immigrants could be targeted on the basis of secret evidence. So I was kind of bringing back McCarthyism policies back to the 90s, and those kind of underlined and justified what we saw with the Patriot Act after September 11th. And so as long as there are US wars abroad, those wars take on domestic form in policies that affect Arab immigrant communities here. And what we're seeing now, in addition to the Muslim ban, which I've mentioned, and is a topic that a lot of people don't know much about, is the surveillance of Arab American communities in the United States, which is another huge issue that Arab American youth activists of today are rising up against, through the framework of Stop the Global War on Terror, which includes the war abroad and the war here against our communities. So what I wanted to add to this discussion is that in addition to the structures that target Arab American youth, or that Arab American youth are challenging, like war and racism abroad and in the US, there's a whole nother area that's essential to discuss if we're going to talk about Arab American youth activism. And that is the problem of repression. So there is a profound institutionalized project or projects that seek to silence the voices of Arab American youth. These are funded $1 million a year, by, say, for example, Israeli lobby groups, as well as military corporations. And what these structures, these institutionalized projects of repression do is they take an Arab American youth student, for example, who organizes an event to criticize US-led war or US funding of Israel, saying that, these policies are harming my people, displacing them from their lands in Palestine and Iraq, for example. Then what happens is a group comes in and, looks at the social media post of one of these students and then reposts it on another website saying that this student, and uses their name, is a terrorist. And they come up with all these explanations of how the student supports terrorism. So they basically twist their language and portray them as a terrorism on various websites. And this ends up harming the student, in some cases, for the rest of their lives. I even just had a student who had something they posted on Pinterest when they were 13 years old, and now they're 18 years old. And this photo, it really didn't have anything controversial, but it was, remade, and the story was retold about what that picture represented. And now that student is fearing, never being able to get a job, being seen as a terrorist supporter. And it can be incredibly scary, to be 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, right? And have all this stuff online about you saying that you support terrorism simply because you're speaking up against the killing of your people, or, racism, which they see, many other youth standing up to critique from other communities. And so, if we wanted to connect that, so that's that one issue, is repression. But then there's another issue of misrepresentation and being misunderstood. So, and it stems partly because Arab Americans are forced to check Caucasian, but youth tend to feel like, and it's not just a feeling, it's a reality, that most people just know nothing about the Arab world, don't know much about, Palestine, Iraq, the Muslim ban, surveillance. And so youth tend to feel like they're constantly having to explain themselves and explain the issues. And it just gets really tiring, because you don't see a change being made, and you have to keep defending yourself against the charge of, being a terrorist supporter, or, the story is always kind of twisted. And so you always have to, try to fix this story. And so that's why, and here's another term for you, that's why an essential part of Arab American youth activism is the project of creating a counter-discourse. So creating a counter-discourse, which basically means that you're not just fighting against policies, like you're not just going out and saying, we need to change these policies, so let's call, our senator. That's not going to be enough, because most people are, either going to misinterpret what you're saying or not know what you're talking about in the first place. And so that's why Arab American youth activism has been committed to creating counter narratives or counter discourse, which is an attempt to bring Arab narratives to the US public, to school settings, to universities, to shift the consensus and to shift the balance of powers as a result. So that's why you might see, like when I mentioned the Iraq war in the 90s, this was a moment where Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, said on 60 Minutes that the price of killing 60,000 Iraqi children was worth it. And so imagine being an Arab kid, knowing that the Secretary of State said that the price of killing all these children was worth it. So at that time, Arab youth were creating a counter discourse. They put up a billboard, on the freeways in San Francisco, and it said, US sanctions are destroying my generation. So in that counter discourse, they're trying to humanize the children of Iraq so that's an example of a counter discourse, of trying to tell a different story than the one that's being told. So if there's, anything I would suggest, it would be to uplift and support Arab American youth's efforts to create these counter discourses, and to allow their analysis of what's happening to their communities to rise up, and create space for it against the repression and the silencing that's ongoing. Another one is to say that criticizing Israel does not equal anti-Semitism, because that's a real big one. That's the big one that Arab American youth are constantly targeted for. When they criticize Israeli state policy, these youth are seen as being anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. So that's another space we need to make more space for youth to put out their critiques of any system that they feel is harmful and enacting social injustices against their communities. Women will create a counter discourse, say, for example, if, when George Bush said we're going to Afghanistan to save the women, as if bombing people will actually liberate women. So that was a big counter discourse of young Arab American women would say, only we can liberate ourselves. So it's interesting to pay attention to these counter discourses that Arab American youth are putting out. Another one is progressive except for Palestine. People say PEP, which basically is a critique of the way that in most progressive discussions, or even DEI discussions, diversity, equity, inclusion, you can talk about anything, but you can't talk about Palestine, or you'll be equated with anti-Semitism if you criticize Israel, as we said. I recently saw a poster that an Arab American youth posted during this last Israeli attack on Jerusalem that said, "They call for our death, we call for our freedom." And so I'll just close by, giving some examples of some of the activism we're seeing today, of the groups, and you could look them up, so I don't go on for too much longer here. So we see the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is one movement that Arab American youth are involved in, and it's a movement calling for boycott of Israel. And one thing that's interesting about it is, when youth participate in a boycott movement, there's a common understanding that it's not necessarily about achieving a full boycott, but really it's a conversation starter. It's like if people say to BEYONCE, don't perform in Israel, the folks who made that call might not expect BEYONCE to cancel her concert. I mean, she might, but what it does is it creates, a buzz. Wait, what is it? Where is BEYONCE going? Why are they saying that? And then that gives an opportunity to have a conversation, right, about what's happening in Palestine and Israel. So that movement has been around since 2000, the Arab American youth boycott movement. And today, one formation it takes is the Palestinian Youth Movement. And one group connected to that is the Palestinian Feminist Collective, if you're interested in looking at it. And then there's a broader group that many Arab American youth are involved in called the Dissenters, which is, from their website, leading a new generation of young people to reclaim our resources from the war industry, reinvest in life-giving services, and repair collaborative relationships with the earth and people around the world. And there's a lot of effort to link activism against war and militarism among Arab American youth organizers to the struggle of abolition, abolishing the prison industrial complex, based on the assumption that militarism and policing today share technologies more than ever before. So the surveillance of Arab American communities is linked up with and tied up with the technologies used by police. And then that extends to the movement to abolish ICE and the movement in support of undocumented communities, right? That protecting borders is very much connected to US-led war on terror, right? Because strengthening the border is about strengthening the nation state. And so there's a lot of connection around abolish ICE and abolish militarism. Militarization of the border is probably a more useful word to talk about policing of borders, or both. So there we could see policing the struggles against policing, the struggles against militarism, and the struggles against border control are all interconnected in some of these coalitional movements, like the group, the Dissenters, for example. So I'll just close by saying, there's also a lot of commitment to healing that we're noticing today around building collective, spaces for nurturing each other, and not only fighting for what people are against, but really trying to envision what kind of world people want to live in. And those efforts often attempt to draw upon Arab histories. So, what can we draw on from our ancestors, for example? Youth are saying, what can we draw on from our homelands that can guide us as we create the new world that we want to live in? So are there, maybe there are healing practices or relationship to the land or to gardening, for example, that folks can learn and draw on to maintain that connection, the historical connections to people's countries of origin, while also moving forward and trying to build collective spaces with other communities under attack, communities of color, Indigenous people in the US, and connecting up those various healing practices and, coming into those spaces empowered through who one is and where they come from. And so along those lines, really, I'll close with this really interesting quote I read in a personal essay by an author called Zaina Zatari in the book Arab and Arab American Feminisms, where she talks about, coming to the US from Lebanon and really feeling a lack of belonging as a youth, in the United States as a student. But when they went to their first anti-war movement, that was the first time they felt that they belonged. They said the greatest sense of belonging they ever had was on the streets of San Francisco, with tens of thousands of other people joining together to, demand an end to militarism. So I thought that was an interesting way of thinking about home and the concept of belonging to be found within an anti-war protest. Thank you so much.